This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Our next speaker is David Oderberg from Reading, and he will talk about the Great Unifier form and the unity of the organism.
Thank you very much for asking me to speak. There's a handout, there's a slideshow with some pretty pictures, and this is quite a long paper, so I'm not going to subject you, and I won't have the time to subject you to all, but I'm going to do a combination of sort of reading some key things and skipping through some other things and omitting some detail as well, but I'm hoping just to get across, at least if you sort of bear with me, to get across the gist of what I'm trying to do, even if I don't necessarily spell out all the steps of the argument. So just to begin with a quote from the famous mathematical biologist Darcy Wentworth Thompson that's on the handout. The biologist as well as the philosopher learns to recognise that the whole is not merely the sum of parts. It is this and much more than this. It's not a bundle of parts, but an organisation of parts in a mutual arrangement, fitting one with another in what Aristotle calls a single and indivisible principle of unity. This is no merely metaphysical conception, but is in biology a fundamental truth. This organisational harmony of interacting parts is something that we find both within and without biology, right? So we find the unity of chemical, inorganic chemical compounds, and submolecular and subatomic elements, components as well, or lumps of uranium and iron ore and so on. I think all of these are subjects of wonder, and sort of the unity of these various, the harmony of these various entities cries out for explanation. But in biology, as Thompson makes clear, following Aristotle before him, there's a special kind of unity, and Terence Irwin puts it in a nice way when he's commenting on Aristotle's discussion of animal souls. A collection of flesh and bones constitutes a single living organism insofar as it is teleologically organised. The activities of the single organism are the final cause of the movements of the different parts. And I think this can be put in a slightly less tendentious way for philosophers who just reflexively recoil at talk of teleology and final causes. One way of putting it is to say that organisms act for their own sustenance, maintenance and development. Their parts serve the overall goal of the organism's flourishing. And I use a slightly more traditional terminology here, although it was revived by a paper a while back, a few decades back, by Rod Chisholm. I say that organisms display immanent causation. It's causation that originates with an agent, terminating in the agent for the sake of the agent's self-perfection. Now this is a kind of teleology that is distinctive. It's not just action for a purpose, but for the agent's own purpose. And having its own purpose means not just that the agent acts for a purpose it possesses, but it acts for a purpose it possesses such that by fulfilling it, it contributes to its own self-perfection. And by self-perfection, I don't mean that it aims or acts to achieve some sort of ideal type, but that something more modest, that every organism aims, consciously or not, at the fulfillment of its potentialities, such that it achieves a good state of being, or whatever, the best state that it can reach given its own limitations and the environmental limitations. And I think this unity of the organism is a teleologically organised unity, cries out for explanation. But more generally, I think there is a unity problem for all substances, again to use some Aristotelian terminology, both inorganic and organic. And the way I've put this unity problem in other things I've written is really a question of what holds the essences of substances together. And if you don't like essentialism, then again I can put it slightly more modestly, what holds the natures, without any sort of commitment to the modal status of these natures, what holds the natures of various substances together. Sometimes, this has been called in very some recent literature on this, e.g. by Travis Dunsday, as the problem of complex essences. He puts it in terms of the question of the linkage of the inherently separable components into a single kind essence. In the inorganic world, you have the electron shares its unit negative charge with the tau lepton, but not its mass. It shares its mass with the positron, but not its charge. The same applies to organisms. There's pretty pictures. The flying squirrel and the sugar glider share a gliding membrane, but not a pouch. The sugar glider shares a pouch with the kangaroo, but not a gliding membrane. These properties that I've mentioned are all essential or properties of the nature of the thing. They're partially definitive of things to which these properties and characteristics belong. But they're also separable, they're really distinct. You know, you find them co-instantiated in some cases and not in others. So in that sense, the question of unity problems, what holds these things together? What unifies the characteristics into a single sort of nature? And in the organic case, it's particularly acute because of this, what I mentioned, the kind of teleological organization of the organism, its overall flourishing. The organism seeks to bring about its flourishing by employing its own parts and powers and various other characteristics. So in other words, the organism, by engaging in immanent causation, displays a further kind of unity beyond the mere harmony and integration of the parts. Now, there are various attempts that one might make to try to explain the unity. I think it does have to be explained. One might try to do it in terms of laws, that there are somehow laws holding these characteristics together. And I don't think that works for reasons of detail that I'm not going to go into here, but just to say, just generally, that one gets into all sorts of problems, like, for example, Jonathan Lowe says that, well, when it comes to, say, the electron and its negative charge, there's a law that, you know, holds, as it were, the nature of the electron together in such a way that the electron has a unit negative charge, but as I've objected, other people have objected, it's not really a law of nature that electrons have a unit negative charge, it's what it is to be an electron, having, among other things, a unit negative charge. And so, you know, the question of what kind of law would it be that would hold these characteristics together? A necessary law, a contingent law? You know, if it's necessary, well, how is it that these characteristics are not always co-instantiated? But if contingent, well, you know, you've got these problems with the contingency of laws generally. And again, what kind of law would it be? But I can talk maybe about that more if not ask me. You could say it's just a brute fact, the unity is a brute fact. I just think that that's unacceptable. You know, there is, okay, so reminded of a quote by famous expression by J.L. Austin, you know, I'm going to subject you to 45 minutes of Stone Age metaphysics, especially following Professor Moreno's very informative talk. But, you know, I see there to be a strict difference between an organism and an organ on one hand, and an organism and a collective or an aggregate, I'm using the terms interchangeably, on the other. And so appealing to immanent causation is just not enough, because organs have a kind of immanent causation. You know, hearts, livers repair themselves and engage in, you know, have homeostasis, show homeostasis and so on. Colonies act for their own good and et cetera, et cetera. So there's got to be something more. And I think there is just an intuitive difference between the organ, the organism, and the colony. And the way I put it is like this, that an organ has the same kind of tight unity that an organism has. But the difference is that the organ is subservient to the organism of which it's a part. The organism, the collective, on the other hand, has a loose unity, and these are just terms of art, a loose unity. It's different from the unity of the organism, but like the organism, the collective is not itself subservient to anything else. The organism, on the other hand, occupies this middle position where it has the tight unity that you find in an organ, but on the other hand, is not subservient to any other thing, unlike the organ. So the organ has a unity which is both tight but subservient. The collective has a unity which is loose but non-subservient, whereas the organism has a unity which is both tight and non-subservient. And I think this is at least an intuitive difference that needs to be accounted for. But again, I'm sure people are going to really question whether this is something that needs explaining. It seems to me that it's something that needs explaining, and I can say a bit more about that later on. So what I want to appeal to, when I talk the Great Unifier, is to put some good old-fashioned Stone Age Aristotelian metaphysics to account for the unity of the organism in terms of substantial form. And I was gratified to see that there's going to be at least one other paper at this conference defending some form of hylemorphism, so I don't feel completely alone in this, but it is making a comeback in bits of parts of philosophy of biology. Substantial forms are the universal determining principles whereby things are endowed with their substantial natures and their accidental characteristics. Substantial forms are not kinds as such. I don't want you to think, oh, substantial form, he's just talking about universal kinds. That's not the case. There's more to it than that. So it's true that the substantial form has associated with it a kind, a universal kind. Substantial forms, considering in the abstract, are universal. They're not just kinds. And the main way of putting this is to say that each individual substance has one substantial form. This is the famous doctrine of the unicity of form, substantial form. But each individual substance belongs to many kinds. So the eastern grey kangaroo belongs to the species, the individual belongs to the species eastern grey kangaroo, as well as to other higher kinds such as marsupial, mammal, and so on. But it's only got the one form, the form of the eastern grey kangaroo, and everything else is, all the other kinds kind of abstractions from that. So the substantial form I take to be a unifier in a concrete sense. That is to say that each individual substance belonging to some species or other has its own particular substantial form, unifying it, making it an organism. Now, I take this just to get clear, this is not strictly a scientific matter, right? I'm not advancing a scientific hypothesis, I'm advancing a metaphysical hypothesis. So form is not a scientific postulate, it's a metaphysical postulate. Biologists could not and have not discovered the existence of form any more than physicists ever discovered the existence of matter. Right? Physicists discover the kinds of matter there are and also the kinds of energy that there are, the way in which matter is found, different kinds of thing, but no physicist ever discovered matter. If there was, I'd like to know who that physicist was. They obviously should get posthumous Nobel Prize. No biologist, I claim, correlatively, ever did or could discover form. It's a metaphysical postulate. Although biologists discover the particular forms in nature, the particular substantial forms. They don't think of them unless they're they're not going to think of them as substantial forms. They discover the forms in nature. That's perfectly kosher biological talk, the sort of talk that Darcy Wentworth-Thompson himself famously engaged in. So, question is, well, why postulate it? I say postulate substantial form if it can do the work of explaining the unity that needs explaining. And here, what I want to focus on is the way substantial form, in my view, helps us to delineate between the organ, the organism, and the collective. Now, by organ, I want to make clear I'm using that in a slightly gerrymandered or maybe stipulative sense. So when we think of organs, we think of livers, hearts, lungs, and so on. I mean organ in something in a broader, more metaphysically interesting sense. By organ, I mean any biologically significant part of an organism. And by biologically significant, again, I mean that in a slightly particular sense, that any biologically significant part of an organism that is contributing to the imminent causation that the organism undergoes or carries out. Not just any old lump of flesh, extracted from the body, but some biologically significant part. What you'd find in various kinds of biology textbooks, like textbooks of functional anatomy and so on. In that sense, this is an organism. This is an organ, right? Normally we say it's not an organ, it's a limb, or it's a joint or something. But I take all of these things to be organs if they are biologically significant bits, discrete bits of organisms that contribute to the proper functioning of the organism. Well, might say it's vagueness here. It's just vague as to the boundaries between the organism, and the collective. So what do you want about this? Really is Stone Age in the bad sense. Well, there are problems, and there are so many hard cases, and a lot of this paper is taken up with discussing some of the difficult cases, and there are other cases I don't begin to touch on. And please don't ask me about the Portuguese man or whatnot. Just don't. If you really can't resist, ask me, but I'm not going to tell you a lot. But, you know, there are difficult cases. I totally accept that, but I want to resist the idea that the vagueness is onto. I want to resist that. I'm not offering a knockdown argument. I prefer more of an appeal to ignorance. So the way I would put it is, say, well, what kind of thing could there be lying between the organism and the collective? What would be its essential features? What kind of teleology would it manifest? Now maybe there are some things that can be said here, but I'm kind of just a general appeal to ignorance. I just find it hard. Maybe it's just a failure of imagination. I just can't get a grip on what there is between the organism, and the aggregate or the collective. But, you know, the goal of my paper is more to justify form rather than to prove the existence of what it explains. So I'm going to kind of leave some of these bigger questions hanging for the moment. Let me begin with one example now. So, where one might say there's a vagueness here, lichens. That's the first thing I came across when I looked at this paper, and I'm looking specifically at John here because John makes a lot of hay, as it were, with lichens. John cites lichens as an example of, quote, multi-species organisms, symbiotic associations of photosynthetic algae or bacteria with a fungus. Now, he notes the anomalousness of such an object from the perspective of the traditional, quote, dichotomy between unicellular organisms and monogenomic multicellular organisms. And then he says, well, quotes, it's quite unproblematic when we approach multicellularity from a more, quote, comprehensive perspective. Now, I think there's an innocent reading of this passage and a not so innocent reading of this passage. The relatively innocent reading of the passage reflects, I think, a commitment to the special category of organism, but rather a broadening of the category to include multigenomic organisms. A less innocent reading, which I'm going to adopt given the context of the chapter, not out of malice, but given the entire context of the chapter in which John is writing, is that it in a way downgrades the category of organism itself. After all, if there are even multi-species organisms, what's so special about the term organism after all? You know, what is so special about it, ontologically speaking? Lichens an example of the vast heterogeneity we find in living systems. Well, okay, so I'm going to start putting myself out on a real limb here, if I haven't already, by saying that lichens are not nearly as worrisome for my view as they might seem. So, lichens are sometimes called, quote, dual organisms. I can't remember that John actually uses that expression in that, the chapter I'm referring to. Dual organisms. You do see it in the literature, talk of lichens as dual organisms, because of the symbiotic relation between the mycobiome. So here, more pretty pictures now. That's why I like doing positive biology. I'm used to doing abstract metaphysics. It's very hard to come up with pretty pictures. Without going into the detail of lichens, and probably a lot of you here know more about lichens than I do, I'm sure you know more about lichens than I do, but you've got the two components of the fungus, and either the cyanobacteria, photosynthesizing bacteria, or the photosynthesizing algae. The algae and the bacterial photobiomes. So they're sometimes called dual organisms. But, you know, when I see a term like that, my metaphysical hackles are kind of raised, because a dual organism is no more an organism than a dual carriageway is a carriageway. That a lichen behaves differently from its component organisms does not make it an organism, since the same is true of any collective. You know, think of the swarming birds and bee colonies, they behave differently from their components. And it would be question begging merely to claim that collectives are all organisms for the same reason that lichens are. Now, the trouble with a lot of these cases is there's just so much we still don't know. And when I was researching lichens, then I came up against this, problem that as philosophers, don't say more than we know, and same for biologists. There's a lot we don't know, but As I understand it, a lichen is usually best regarded as a miniature ecosystem, that's fungal common terminology, consisting of two kinds of individual organism, a fungus and an alga or bacteria, a colony as it were within the lichen, a colony of bacteria acting as photosynthesizing agents, working in close symbiosis. As far as we know, most lichen-forming fungi, as also their photobionts, occur in a free-living state in nature or can be cultivated in a laboratory. So you can cultivate the fungus on its own, the lichenizing fungus on its own in the laboratory. It's true they generally don't do as well in the laboratory, and they adopt rather kind of strange shapes compared to the way they do in the lichen, but you can cultivate them in a free-living state. You can cultivate them in the laboratory, and the photobionts are all, as far as I'm aware, found in a free-living state. Actually, I'm not sure about the algae. The cyanobacteria are all found in a free-living state. Now, the fact that either partner can exist free-living distinguishes them metaphysically from a true organ, such as an arm, leg, or eye, that has no free-living state. For an organ to exist separately from its natural body, similar or identical bodily conditions have to be simulated. So, note, to forestall an objection, I'm not saying that being found in a free-living state or even being capable of free-living is a necessary condition of being an organism. I'm saying it's a kind of indicator, right? An indicator towards something more metaphysical, as it were, going on. And it's going to sound strange to a lot of people. It's an indicator that you've got an organism here. It can live on its own. It can quite happily get on its own way, but most of the time in nature it's found in a symbiosis. The other thing which I think may be more interesting, maybe even a stronger point, is that lichen symbionts both reproduce. Hence, to speak of lichen reproduction without qualification is misleading. There is genuine sexual reproduction, where in the germinating mycobiont, spores have to find a suitable photobiont in the environment in order for the successful symbiosis to arise again. Here, it's the fungus that reproduces, not the lichen as a whole. If you Google how do lichens reproduce, as I must have done 1 million times over the last couple of months, how do lichens reproduce, most biologists will tell you that the reproduction of a lichen is characterized in terms of actually the reproduction of the fungus, right? They say, but it's fungal reproduction that we generally talk about when we talk about lichen reproduction. Now, there's also the propagation rather than the reproduction of the lichen as a whole, fungus and photobionts, through asexual reproduction of the fungus. A bit of the fungus breaks off, but it contains some of the photobionts within it. The fungus and the photobionts continue to grow as did their respective parents once a suitable environment is found. I guess, without going into all the detail, the basic point here is that you've got two reproductions going on. There are two activities or processes of reproduction: fungal reproduction and photobiont reproduction. Now, I just find it really odd, philosophically, to think that if a lichen were a single organism in any metaphysically respectable way, that it would be reproducing twice over in two different ways, or that it would be engaging in a process of partial reproduction in two different ways, right? I just take it as a kind of hallmark of organisms that they don't partially reproduce in two different ways, and they don't reproduce twice over, right? They reproduce or they don't reproduce. So you've got two processes of reproduction going on: photobiont reproduction and fungal reproduction. It looks to me like that's an indicator of two different organisms at work. Otherwise, I just don't know what reproduction is. I start to lose a grip. Now, organs, before I say a bit about collectives. So I think lichens are not just a kind of, I don't think lichens are a problem case, but there are harder cases than lichens. So here's what I want to say about, generally speaking, about the relationship between organs, organisms, and collectives. What I want to say, there's some examples of some colonies there. Just an interesting point, that's the carpenter bee, and the carpenter bee is a facultatively colonial organism. So again, one of the sort of interesting things about some colonies, some colonies are obligate, some colonies are facultative, and the carpenter bee, I don't know about this recently. There are solitary bees out there that just don't form hives, don't form collectives at all, not interested in them, right? Not eusocial, as they say. I'll say that, good about that in the papers. Here's what I want to say, just generally, the kind of schema here. So, a substance possesses a substantial form. That's good old straight Aristotelian talk. Any Aristotelian knows that substances possess substantial forms. And also Aristotelians tend to say that collectives contain substantial forms. So a collective, like a colony, consists of these substantial individual organisms which have their own substantial forms. So the term I'm using is contains. The collective contains substantial forms. But what I also want to say, something that, I don't know, I've had to neologize because I haven't found any terminology to kind of capture what I want to say here. I don't like neologizing unless I feel I have to, but in this case, the best I've come up with is to say that an organ obtains a substantial form. And I'm taking that, borrowing from the Latin, so abtenere, so holds from. So rather than obtains, I'm thinking of obtains as in deriving, or not deriving, but holding a substantial. It obtains a substantial form, that is, it holds whatever unity it has from the substantial form of the substance to which it is subservient. It obtains a substantial form. Now, this is a tricky concept to grasp, but I think it goes some way towards explaining how substantial form acts as a unifying principle. Now, the organ doesn't have its own substantial form. If it did, it would be a substance. I take organs not to be substances. They're ontologically dependent entities. So I have a bit to say in the paper, and I can't go into the details here about ontological independence. Most kind of metaphysicians who are vaguely Aristotelian nowadays like to think of substances as ontologically independent entities. They're entities that are not themselves, essential parts or other entities. Their identity is not defined in terms of some entity they belong to. They have their own independent existence in that sense. Their identity is defined by what they are, not by what they belong to or what they are contained in, even though they may, in terms of their kind of downstream properties, have to, or some often do, belong to or are contained in other things, as in carpenter bees who may be in colonies if they feel like it, or but usually don't, or actually obligate colonial substances like typical honeybees. But organs, their identity is defined by the substances they belong to. There's no such thing as just hearts. There are hearts of organisms. There are no such things as just livers. There are livers of organisms. There are livers of particular organisms, right? The liver of a human, the liver of a kangaroo, or whatever. And this is what I'm trying to explain, and that's why I've appealed to the notion of obtaining a substantial form. So what I say, it's on the handout here, that something's not an organ unless either it is serving the whole, it's actually serving the whole. I've got a bit of Aristotelian terminology in the brackets here. The organ is actually serving the whole, like my liver right now. Or it's in some way able to carry out its functions as if it were serving a whole. These are cases of simulation, as, when the heart's kept warm and pumping and hooked up to various pipes and stuff to keep it ready for maybe transplantation or something like that. Or it can be kept in a kind of dormant state where the heart's kept on ice, being raced to some person who needs it for a transplant. And with that understood, I want to say that an organ obtains a substantial form only if either one of three things is the case. It actually does belong to its connatural organism, that is to say, the organism that it belongs to by nature, the liver of the kangaroo or whatever. Or it's able to carry out its functions as if it were serving a whole. Only it actually belongs to its connatural organism, or it once belonged to its connatural organism at some prior time, as in cases where it's, let's say, kept warm and so on and, simulated. Or it's come into existence via a causal process that did begin with a distinct organ satisfying one or two. So I'm thinking there are cases of organs that might be generated from cells that belong to some organ, from some indirect process that eventually is traced back to some organism, but the original came from. So the obtaining is the idea I'm trying to capture with the notion of obtaining is that the organ kind of derives its identity, derives what it is, how it functions, what it does from the substance to which it belongs. Right? It's characterized in terms of the substantial. To understand what that organ is, you know, whether as a philosopher or as just a biologist investigating some random organ taken from some random animal, to understand it, both what it is and epistemologically, to understand it, one has to grasp what is the form of the thing that it comes from. Otherwise, you're going to have an incomplete or maybe no knowledge whatsoever. You're not going to understand it in its own terms, purely in its own terms. So, I'll talk more about that in discussion. Collectives. So, really interesting questions arise about various kinds of collectives. And here my view is that the collectives contain various substantial forms but don't themselves possess a substantial form. So you get into real conceptual difficulty if the collective itself has its own substantial form. The collective, in a kind of reverse way to the organ, itself has to be understood metaphysically in terms of the substantial entities that belong to it. So you don't understand a bee colony unless you understand bees. A bee colony cannot be defined except in terms of bees and what they are. Same for an ant colony or a termite colony and so on. Now there's been a lot of talk in recent literature of superorganisms and so on, the idea that collectives are a kind of superorganism. Again, is this downgrading the concept of organism or is it just expanding it? One can debate that. But I think Michael Gislin, among others, has been very good at debunking a lot of this superorganism talk and just saying that some of the analogies that are drawn, e.g. between a beehive and a skeleton and so on, are just so outlandish to be obfuscatory rather than elucidatory. That a lot of it is what some people have called metaphors, poetic metaphors in scientific guise is one quote that's used to describe this superorganism theory. And I certainly want to resist the idea that any kind of colony, aggregate, collective is an organism in any sense worthy of the name. So, biofilms. They're ones that come up a lot as kind of examples of things that look like they're actually individual organisms, but then, we used to think they were colonies and so on. And even if you think they are still, you still think they're colonies. Well, colonies are organisms, but colonies can be organisms. Expand your thinking, expand your imagination here. And there are some, strong people out there and put forward interesting arguments for thinking that biofilms are organisms. Now, I don't think that biofilms are a borderline case between organisms and collectives, and nor do I think that they are organisms themselves. So a biofilm is, as most generally, is a colony of bacteria. They adhere to a surface, producing an extracellular polymeric substance called an EPS matrix that holds the colony together and facilitates protection against predation, communication between the various bacteria, etc., etc. Good old-fashioned dental plaque are biofilms. When you look in the mirror, you look at a biofilm. It gives a whole new kind of thought, meaning to dental care. You can do philosophy of biology as a community. Now, look, there's a lot we don't know about biofilms. But I see them as nothing but extraordinarily close-knit colonies of individual organisms. Now, to start off with, just a bit of an argument from authority, as it were. All biologists, as far as I can tell, refer to them as communities and colonies of individual organisms and so on. Virtually all bacteria can form biofilms. There's nothing special about it. All bacteria pretty much can form biofilms, but they all live quite happily in the planktonic state, the floating about state, whether in the air or in water, and so on. Unless they're stressed by lack of nutrients. They're stressed by lack of nutrients or environment, they start to come together for facilitation of nutrition and protection and so on, and to avoid toxins. But the bacteria within the biofilm maintain their cellular integrity. The biofilm works precisely through the colonization of a surface by free living bacteria. It grows by the reproduction of the bacteria themselves. They continue reproducing themselves. And by the addition of new bacteria. The biofilm itself does not reproduce. And I've seen some confusion in the literature about this. Paper by it's a Hull and Pedroso, the one that argues for in that recent collection on individuality, on Aristotelian and Pedroso, on biofilms as individuals using the interactor account that Hull gives. They reproduce by attraction, but they don't. Biofilms. No. Biofilms don't, that they form by attraction. So some of the terminology is missing. They form by attraction, by agglomeration. They propagate by dispersal, right? They propagate by dispersal. What happens is it gets to a certain point where some of the bacteria within the biofilm through various processes sort of break out, go into their planktonic state and start attracting other bacteria. Process of dispersal. Now I think again, if you're going to say, well, that's just a kind of, expand your imagination. Dispersal is just another kind of reproduction. Then again, I for one, can conceptually use what reproduction is if dispersal is a kind of reproduction. I can see these bacteria, as it were, themselves individually reproducing through cell division, bacterial division, mitosis, and so on. But then if dispersal is also a kind of reproduction, I'm not sure what reproduction is supposed to be anymore. So I see them as propagating rather than reproduce. They disperse and they propagate new colonies by reattachment to other substrates. Also, I'll just say in passing, a very quick point, that they also, Reshevsky and Pedroso, point to the lateral gene transfer thing. So they say, well, biofilms have been discovered to have lateral gene transfer. So there's genetic material exchange between the individual bacteria. That starts to look very individualish to us, they say. They do this to facilitate their mutual protection and communication and so on. That's all done through the EPS matrix. And it starts to look a bit like a cohesive individual here. Well, and they say, well, could contrast that with anticacia symbiosis and the acacia tree and the various kinds of ant. You're going to get lateral gene transfer between aphids and acacias. Right? Symbiosis is different. It's not symbiosis. This looks like individuality on show. And then they mention aphids and the pea aphid and various kinds of bacteria, and say, there's a very famous kind of case of symbiosis between pea aphids and bacteria, and there's no evidence of lateral gene transfer between them. Again, paradigmatic symbiosis that you find in all the textbooks, but there's no lateral gene transfer. But with biofilms, that's a bit different. Well, actually, so I went back to the original paper that they refer to, again with my totally scientifically unqualified abilities, to try and make sense of what's going on there. And as I read the paper, and maybe I'm wrong, but as I read the paper, the authors suggest that there is evidence of potential functional gene transfer between functional gene transfer to the pea aphid not from the Buckmira that it's now associated with symbiotically, not from that one. That's fair enough. I think there's no evidence of that. But they say they leave open the possibility. So the evidence is at least consistent with prior lateral gene transfer from ancient symbiotic bacteria, Rickettsiales. Okay, so they say there's evidence of functional gene transfer from ancient symbionts that are no longer present, Rickettsia bacteria. So I don't know where they got the idea that there's, we just don't have evidence of lateral gene transfer. They're not saying they can prove it, they just say it's open and there is some evidence, there's some evidence pointing in that direction. So, well, okay, so for all I know, if someone discovered tomorrow lateral gene transfer and nailed them on the head between symbionts, I'm not going to throw up my hands. I'm just going to say, well, there you go. You get lateral gene transfer between symbionts. Good discovery. Move on. Whereas they seem to think, we've got some key here to individuality. I just don't think it works like that. I'm keenly aware of the time limitations, so I'm going to have to be very selective in what I talk about. Now, slime molds, I'm going to be very quick on slime molds, as fascinating as they are. So, again, slime molds are often brought up as kind of either borderline cases of individuality or coloniality, or maybe people thought they were colonies, but they're actually organisms, or people thought they were organisms, but they're actually colonies. Well, actually, so here's what I've come up with on slime molds. So, as you probably all know, there are two different kinds of slime molds, right? Not all slime molds are alike. You've got the plasmodial slime molds, which are called by biologists true slime molds, and I think the key there is in the word true. I like biologists. I really like biologists. Probably what I would have been in another world. And you've got the cellular slime molds, like dictyostelium. That's quite interesting that the case, the example I've given of Fruligo septica, affectionately known as the dog vomit slime mold, looks a bit colonial when you look at that kind of random scattering, as it were. And then you look at the dictyostelium cellular slime mold, which is actually measured in millimeters. Looks like an organism, and that's why often the plasmodium is referred to as a slug. You've got what looks like a bit of a slug-type shape there. The interesting thing here is that actually the plasmodial slime mold is, I'm sorry if I'm teaching grandmothers how to suck eggs here, right? This is me trying to work through this as a philosopher. Plasmodial slime molds are actually organisms, on my view. They really do have their own substantial form. And how is that? Well, again, it's indicators that we're looking for, not the magic key. There is no magic key. I think a lot of the literature here, it involves a vain search for the magic key or just giving up altogether. And I don't think we have to give up altogether or find the magic key. We look for indicators of certain metaphysical underliers, as it were. Plasmodial slime molds have a multinucleate structure such that they are not regarded as colonies or collectives of individual cells, but sometimes as one big cell with many thousands, if not millions, of nuclei. Because the individual nuclei don't have their integrated cell membranes separating each cell from the other. It's one big slime with a multinucleate structure. Whereas the cellular slime mold actually is colonial, in my view. Is colonial, as much as it may look there like it's not. Each cell does keep its own integrity, and as John Bonner, who's Princeton, who's as far as I can tell the world's expert on cellular slime molds, he describes them quite, rhetorically as a bag of cells encased in a sheath. To me, that's colonial talk, right? A bag of cells encased in a sheath, each with their own integrity, cellular integrity, but working together in the most amazing ways. I mean, these cellular slime molds, they navigate mazes. Go on YouTube, they can navigate some mazes faster than a human. You put a food source there and they find the shortest way to the exit, faster than some humans can. They're quite, the behavior, I don't want to deny that, not denigrating it. The behavior of cellular slime molds is absolutely amazing. All slime molds are amazing things. Nevertheless, it's an amazing kind of colonial behavior, cellular slime molds. And given that I've only got about a minute left, I'm going to very, very quickly just finish off with just to say, rather than argue the last point. So what I do at the end of the paper is to say that, well, you might say, all this talk about substantial form, what's the point? You don't need it, it's redundant, just, talk about, you need to say all this without going all metaphysical, right? Well, I don't think so, for various reasons, but one way of kind of bringing this out is to contrast the substantial forms view with something slightly different. So there are other philosophers out there who are kind of quasi-Aristotelian, neo-Aristotelian, whatever, who do believe there is a problem of unity, as I do, but who want to explain that unity via appeal to other principles without being to form as such. So, in the full beloved Aristotelian sense. So, for example, the two that I look at in the paper One is Hoffman and Rosenkrantz, who have done some really interesting papers on the unity of the organism. And they say, well, we need to explain the unity, we can do it in terms of functional organisation, functional unity, calling on some of the ideas in Professor Moreno's paper we've just heard, functional integration, cohesive, harmonious behaviour, and so on. Plus, for reasons I won't go into right now, but I can go into, a master part, and I think we got a bit of that in the previous paper as well. A master part, there's got to be some part that regulates the life processes of everything else in the organism, including the behaviour of all the other parts. That's the key to the unity of the organism. That is a principle. That's a way of doing it, right? The question is, does it work? It's not quite a substantial forms view. It's a unity, a functional organisation plus master part. And I think there are counterexamples. I mean, they're committed to the view that a whole plant minus its sap is the plant's master part. Now, I put it to them, that just strikes me as ridiculous. I mean, I've lost a grip on what a master part is. If the whole tree, my whole plant minus the sap is a master part. But there are other things, like what about non-vascular plants, right? Non-vascular plants don't have sap, so what's their master part? Well, you might as well go all mereological and say, well, the non-vascular plant is its own master part, an improper master part. But again, how does that help us to understand anything just by saying that? And pre-gastrulation embryos where there are no nervous systems, let's say nervous systems for vertebrates, vertebrates start off at a pre-gastrulation stage where there's no nervous system, but it's still an organism, it's a developing organism, but it hasn't got a master part as far as I can see. The other principle that I'll end on is Catherine Kozlicki, who was also very sympathetic to the substantial forms view, but she wants to say, in the modern scientific age, we need to think of substantial forms as structures. Form is structure, and the structure works on content rather than on matter in some undefined sense, works on content. Now, that's a really interesting view and one that is worth exploring, and I guess my problem with that is that structure falls prey to a couple of problems that I've mentioned on the handout here, which is one is particularly working out what the content of the relevant structure is. It was two. One is which structure. It's not very well structured. The structure of course, the structure of a non-vascular plant and the structure of a plasmatic. What structure? What kind of structure? There are a number of structures here that we can actually appeal to, and also correlatively, there are a number of contents we can appeal to too. So what is the content that fits the structure that you're interested in? So I think we can again say more about that. So I think that structure, while it's important, is not form. It won't do the job that I think substantial form does. And I'll just finish with a quote from William R. Thompson, another Thompson, not Darcy Wentworth, but William R. Thompson, famous zoologist and entomologist. William R. Thompson says that in the unification of a multiplicity with reference to a specific end, the organism resembles a machine, but it is not, like the machine, unified by the participated activity of a separate mover. It moves itself, and what we call physico-chemical properties or psychological activities are simply the living unit envisaged in abstracto at various levels. They are not true non-living or non-organismal agglomerates unified and moved by something higher. There is nothing to move them but the thing they constitute. In other words, there is nothing to move them but themselves. So again, that's a quote that I certainly would sign up to, and so in that sense, I'm with both Thompsons on that. So thank you very much.